This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author and curator Elliot Bostwick Davis about her new book, Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, Illuminating an American Landscape, and the accompanying exhibit, which runs July 22nd to October 16th at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Both the book and the exhibit examine the impact of Hopper's wife, Jo, on his work and the trajectory of his career. Their relationship started in the summer of 1923 there in Cape Ann, and it wasn't long before the 41-year-old Hopper became a rising star in the art world. And now, a conversation about monumental sacrifices and unacknowledged contributions with author Elliot Bostwick Davis. Elliot Bostwick Davis, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Elliot, you have been working on an exhibit in an accompanying book titled Edward Hopper and Cape Ann, Illuminating an American Landscape. The show and the book are full of beautiful images, specific to a place. But at the heart of it all is a story about two people who meet midlife and find each other, and it kind of changes the trajectories of their lives, right?
It very much does. And, for me, I think many people know I did work as part of the team working on the Edward Hopper show for the MFA in Boston, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 2007. So I was immersed in that early period of his formation, really from the period when he left NIAC and worked as an illustrator in New York City, and started with Robert Henry at the New York School of Art, but also worked with two other instructors, William Merritt Chase and Ken Hayes Miller. And I really was working on the illustration, the early work, some of the early paintings, and especially his etchings that he did to support himself along with his illustrated work. So I was not working on the Gloucester years. That was really the purview of the main curator at the time, organizing the show, Carol Troyan. And so for me, the whole Gloucester years were really not something I had focused on. And as I was invited to work on this project, thanks to a former MFA colleague, Oliver Barker. We had worked together for a number of years. He was in development and now director of the Cape Ann Museum and doing great things there. And when I came back from the museum I was directing in Florida to be here, he asked me about this project. And I said, well, let me think if I have something to say, Oliver. And as I got into the literature, and of course, a lot had happened since 2007, I noted that the Gloucester years were really glossed over. And I ended up having a lot of questions myself about who was Josephine Versteel Nivison, what was more about her background, where she exhibited, her role as an artist. And that really opened the door. I learned many people had actually worked on her, but the story had not perhaps had its moment and its time. And now maybe could be the time. So that's what I went back and proposed to Oliver, that we really dig into these years in Gloucester and think about how her role might have really shaped their time there in those 5 summers.
Well, it's obvious in your book. It kind of starts out as the starting of a summer love story, right? There are these two people whose trajectories just sort of cross. Maybe we can start with who Edward Hopper was in 1923. I mean, he is in the face of midlife and has kind of been grinding as an illustrator up to that point, correct?
That's right. He's won some prizes as an etcher, and he's had some success in that realm. And he's won a prize for one of his posters, and really is able to put in, really to support himself as an artist through his illustrated work, his popular magazines and Scribner's and other kinds of magazines. But it's interesting, about to be 41, exhibiting regularly. He's already had a one-man show at the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio, which was then a very prominent place to exhibit, thanks to his good friend Guy Penn-Dubois, who was a teacher, good colleague, classmate at the New York School of Art. So he has these friends connecting him, but he hasn't broken through. And clearly his colleagues called him the John Singer Sargent of the Henry class. So he had great facility with drawing. We know that from his drawings that survive of those years. but he just can't quite get a break, it seems. He can't quite get out of the pack. And he has two exact contemporaries, meaning, he's got two other artists on either side, born in 1882, Rockwell Kent, who breaks through early on Monhegan, where Henry went to paint and he lived there, and also George Bellows, who was like a surrogate son for Robert Henry. And so those two have managed to make it through. And yet Edward Hopper, as you say, is still working dutifully on those oil paintings. He's working with Leon Kroll when he first goes to Gloucester in 1912. And yet he just can't get the attention in the New York press yet.
And this particular summer we're speaking of in 1923, he crosses paths with Jo Nivison. At this point, she's almost as much known as a theater player and a dancer as a painter, right?
She seems very, from all accounts, very exuberant. She was a great conversationalist. She had a huge network of friends and circle of friends in these various circles. So she was part of the Washington Square Players. That was an amateur group. She was a professional woman. She had graduated from what was then the New York College of New York, it was the Normal College of New York, which is now Hunter College. So she had a degree to enable her to teach children in the public schools. And through that, she certainly had contacts as well. She contributed to progressive magazines like The Masses, which was edited by John Sloan, one of the other members of Henry's circle. So she was very plugged in. And she clearly enjoyed a wide circle of friends. So that seemed, and loved to dance. I mean, physically, it seems she loved movement and was very, even into her older age, very described often as sprightly, that her ponytail bobbed when she spoke and she was very animated. Henry describes her as a human question mark. She loved listening to conversations almost with her full body, the full force of her body forming a question mark for him as he imagined it. So she was already in play as an artist. Her works were being exhibited in galleries that were prominent at the time. The Rosenberg Gallery showed artists like Charles Birchfield, whom she showed with, but also the Zorachs, William and Marguerite, who were good friends, who were also in Provincetown with her, Florine Stettheimer, friends of hers like Marston Hartley, whom she also knew out in Provincetown. And even the modernists like Picasso and Modigliani were showing there. So she was in she was in good company. And I think she often gets dismissed as an artist because I think people don't necessarily see her as being a major person in play. She also was selected, I found interesting as I got into the research, for a major touring show internationally already when she showed up in Gloucester in 23. She had her work already selected, not just for the local major venue of watercolors at the Brooklyn Museum that coming fall in November, but she also was already part of this painting show selected by another artist's wife named Marie Sternberg, and it was going to London and Paris. So she was very much in play, connected, but yet she was still single. And it's unclear, she seemingly had noted Edward Hopper over the years. She remembered him from Monhegan in 1916 and that he had these wonderful long legs for dancing, but she said he didn't use them, probably for dancing with her. And, they clearly were in the same boarding house in Ogunquit. So these summer colonies where Henry recommended the artists go for further, to really stretch, I think, their artistic reach, that was really part of their practice. Of course, New York City was also unair conditioned in those years. So it was sensible to try to beat the heat and also have a chance to explore some of these colonies with other colleagues. So she clearly, and I found some work that suggests they were actually painting together in Ogunquit, even though they were not just sharing the table, but I think they were actually painting as she did in Gloucester side by side. So that's something to still bear out. And that came out after the catalog went to press. So there wasn't really a way other than to just mention the work there. Because the Whitney, again, this was a project that occurred during a pandemic. So it was a little hard to get into everything in depth, but that'll be for future scholars to go back to.
In this particular summer that we kind of focus in on, and the additional years when they did make trips to Gloucester, I think we make a case that Jo has an influence on Hopper's work, and of course, as it plays out, she becomes more ingrained in every aspect of his life and the business of Hopper. But in the beginning, how did his work start to evolve now that Jo was alongside of him, even just in that first summer?
So I think first off, the choice of watercolor is a really important one. And that was her favorite medium. They're, of course, painting out of doors. It's very portable. It's, of course, much more spontaneous. It suits her personality. She loved to mix the colors right on the paper. Also, watercolor is often hard to control. So an artist like Sargent, as skilled as he was, and of course Hopper bears this nickname of the John Singer Sargent of Henry's class, he called it watercolor is, really an emergency. In other words, you're just creating with this emergency of the water and the pigment that floats in it. So it, I think, helped Hopper get out of his own way. He was very much a planner. You can tell that from the way he executes even his watercolors. You can see where the underdrawing of graphite pencil is visible, and then he'll layer on the wash. He'll often that summer let himself break free. And I think we do see, I hope what will be surprising for visitors is how his personality changes with Joe in his circle and close by, and obviously painting with him in these outdoor excursions, but how he loves and really relishes that light and air and atmosphere that is Cape Ann, that's so special, because very different from the oils he painted outdoors with Leon Kroll in 1912. So he's there, already more than a decade earlier at the invitation of another artist, very much his age, and painting in oils. But the watercolor, I think, really gives him that freedom, that chance to explore. And it was a major medium of the American modernists. It was seen as very au courant. George O'Keeffe's using it. The Zoraks are using it. Even Rockwell Kent was selected for the watercolor show, the biennial at in Brooklyn Museum. So major figures, even though Henry's not teaching it. I think he thought of it too much. It had too many associations as a women's medium. So yet many of these modernists are really exploring it in exciting ways.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like one of the works that seemed to free him up the most was this painting of the captain's house, where there are like these yellow awnings that are kind of blowing in the wind. And unlike the majority of Hopper's work, we actually see trees, right? Like, when you go through the majority of his work, it feels like he would excise trees from the landscape, because it's like, in my mind, he had an affinity for solid forms, and that there was, the only time we see trees the majority of the time is if they're far enough in the distance that they can almost take like a shrub-like shape, right?
Yes, very much.
But this particular painting, it's very free. It's much looser than we normally see. And, there's not a great, you mentioned the graphite lines, and again, I'm looking at the reproductions, that even those lines don't seem really to stand out. There's a lot of implied line in these watercolors. There's not like a strong graphite line that is holding everything up. He's actually using a lot of color for the forms, right?
He most definitely is. And I think, that was the one that the critic for the Brooklyn Eagle, so just to give you the story around the mansard roof, he paints the mansard roof. It's of Rocky Neck, and it's of a house that you can still see today. So visitors to Gloucester can take the walk out to Rocky Neck, where many of the artists were living. So it's a little bit even further than the town that was accessible by railroad. And there, apparently that's where Jo was spending her summer. But she does recall many years later, on their 18th anniversary, she remembers Edward waking her up with this sort of silly song that was performed by a young girl as part of a marionettes performance that they went to watch on Rocky Neck. And it's called The Frog Goes A-Wooing. And it's a very tall, lanky, shy frog. And it's a pert little mouse. And she says it has this little bow on its tail. So it's sort of very prim and proper, I guess, but very sprightly, much like her. And she said, well, we always felt that marionette performance was made for us. So you have this feeling that with the mansard roof, and again, this is all we have to use, as we say, visual and artistic. In artistic research, we have to use visual evidence. So we're using the mansard roof watercolor you've described as visual evidence of what's happening in their relationship. So, of course, the center of the composition are these side-by-side awnings, caught up by the atmosphere surrounding them. You just described beautifully how Edward Hopper loves trees only when they sort of behave as a background, scrim, limb, or maybe they, and occasionally on the Cape Cod scenes, they'll look like one carved almost tree out of wood. But here they're absolutely alive and blowing. They're rendered with splashes even of reddish paint that he's using, whether those are blossoms or something that inspires him to use that. And they're also casting these very lively shadows across the screen underneath the porch itself, where these awnings are hung to shield everyone sitting there from the breeze. So it's such a lively scene. Jo herself loved painting trees. She she even found them to be anthropomorphic and to move. And I think that's maybe part of her affinity as a dancer, for seeing these branches in motion as though they're human limbs, perhaps moving in the breeze. So again, is that a little bit of a nod to Jo, or that moment? We can't say, but we can certainly surmise that's what's happening based on what she later reports about the importance of Rocky Neck. And we know that from I was able to find in the Gloucester Daily Times, the performance was actually listed in the Gloucester Daily Times. Each of the segments, each of the areas of Cape Ann had a little write-up in the local paper. And so this young girl's performance was clearly well enough known that it made the Gloucester Daily Times.
When they're there, they're working next to each other. And it's really interesting to see that their works included where we can see that they've set up plein air right next to one another. And it's kind of interesting to see, where each of their strengths lie, right? I mean, it's obvious, maybe it's from Hopper's years and years of illustration, you can tell that he, as a draftsman, as someone that he seemed to really have a grasp of linear perspective. But Jo was doing things with color that were so much more freer and brighter, right?
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And I think, we often, there's a lot of talk, they even refer to it themselves, that they have different orientations of the paper. He's over 6'4" when they meet, and he grew to be over 6'2" when he was a young boy, as before even hit, as he was growing, he was 12 years old, he was already over 6 feet. Jo was probably just a little bit over 5 feet, and maybe never even said, but clearly well more than a head shorter than her husband. But she loves the vertical paper orientation for her composition. So you see them choosing similar scenes. And of course, that's immediately going to change how you might think of orienting a scene of the same view. So for instance, I love the way in 23, they both paint Our Lady of Good Voyage, sometimes known as the Portuguese Church. And he's really focusing on this, bold horizontal of the schoolyard, and framed at one end by the school building with an American flag, kind of barely catching the breeze, and another utility pole, which appears frequently in his scenes. And she is completely at the foot of the towers, looking up at the figure of the Madonna holding a fishing schooner and not holding the Christ child. And again, it was such a memory of Gloucester that stayed with her, that later on, when Edward served during the Second World War, when they were living on Cape Cod as a spotter for enemy boats off the coast, she remembered that she referred in her journals to the figure of the Our Lady, hoping to keep all of the young service people safe during the Second World War. And so she recalled that. But it's just interesting to see. So in that period, especially of 1928, so their last full summer on Cape Ann, they're both painting the train yards almost at exactly the same spot, or Gloucester roofs almost at exactly the same place on the railing. And yet it's very interesting. I think there you do see their personalities coming through. She loves the white of the paper. She loves artists like Cezanne. So she's going to paint the trees in a way that, layers the wash with bright yellows and greens. And yet when they come to the circus grounds out at Stage Fork Park, there you see where you can see the similar elements, the granite boulders of Cape Ann along the road, or this gazebo that's clapboard, and some flags, American flags in Hopper's case, and she just paints flags in her case, flying in the distance. But what's interesting is this glimpse of a dingy ochre circus tent makes just a very minimal appearance in hers. She loves the yellow, bright cadmiums of the striped circus yellow tents. And his image is going to really focus on that dingy ochre tent that stretches between an automobile and a rusted sort of circus van that's parked there, a freight car for transport. So he's very focused on the modernization of these towns, and what's gained and maybe what's lost is left for us to consider.
And it's very interesting, you're talking about there are different perspectives. Compositionally, I don't think I'd stop to consider how Hopper would work on the horizontal and work in these tiers, like a 3 tiers of content. When you mention it in the book and we start looking, I'm like, oh my gosh, he really does go back to this as some place of comfort compositionally in his etchings and again in some of his most striking work, right? And right to that, the painting you were mentioning of Our Lady of Good Voyage, those 3 strata. I don't know if it's somehow a device that he's using to try to create space. The top tier will feel further away, but it's an interesting device that seems kind of unique to Hopper.
It definitely has this architectural feeling to it. And he's someone who, I think of him, and I think it's great that you can actually visit the Hopper House and Study Center, who's been a great partner for this project. And we do have some, I think, wonderful works that people may not have seen of the boat models he made as a teenager when he built a full-scale catboat. He made these model boats in his paint box. But what he said in those, he reflected later in his life. So he's in his, already in his late 70s when he interviews in 1962 with Catherine Koo. But he remembers that as a child, he was fascinated by the light on the second story of a house and how it had a certain elation to it. And it was he talks about light being such an expressive force in his paintings. But I think the fact that he's studying the house, and of course in Gloucester, he famously says that everybody else was painting the harbor. He almost never paints the harbor. You see it very much either constrained or way in the distance. And to your point earlier about how he's not comfortable with the movement of certain, of trees or even of water, it's hard for him. But he loves and really responds to that solidity of architecture. And I think that really comes together for him in Gloucester. And I think it's something we could even see and play out. I could have probably in the book played out even further in paintings like, An Office at Night, where he talks about how important the office furniture and the architecture of the office and the building is to him. So again, I think these back streets of Gloucester that are layering the clapboards one onto another, the intersections of these streets. This is quite fascinating to his eye, and it's something that I think Joe, as the influence, I think there I felt I could use the Robert Henry art spirit, which was put together by a female student, a good friend of Joe's, named Marjorie Ryerson, who worked with Henry to put the notes that were mostly from Marjorie and other female students who had these notes that then Henry could polish a bit into the art spirit, which was published in 1923 in that fall, not the summer they were there, but soon thereafter. So I do think Joe, who greatly admired and felt that Robert Henry was the prophet of the age, was very much reinforcing many of these statements of Henry's. And so that, again, was another way to think about how could we shed further light on what we don't have as archives, and certainly during a pandemic didn't have as archives. So how could I love the art spirit. I recommend it to everyone. It's a great read. But I wanted to read it again in light of these works of the summers in Gloucester and see whether we could find anything else and tease anything else out.
At the end of these summers, they go back to their home in the middle of New York, what's part of the village. It seems like they were actually living within like a block of each other. Eventually, they marry and they move in together into his space, and the quarters are pretty cramped, right? Mm-hmm. In my mind, somewhere along the way, especially with her choosing to take on the role of promoting him, the amount of space for her to work kind of gets squeezed to a point where she's kind of takes on more of an office manager role than working on her own work, just by the nature of space, right? But she contends that she never stopped working. Correct.
She never stopped painting. And I think also in the book wanted to make sure that I included all of the images of Edward Hopper painting Joe, and Hopper painting Joe Nivison painting, because I think that's very telling as well. The artists in his circle, of Henry's circle, many of them were married to fellow students who were women and were also painters and obviously known in the class and exhibiting their work. But I couldn't find a single one who showed the women as painters actually working. And he does that in 3 of the watercolors. He does it in the oil, called Joe Painting. So it's titled Joe Painting, even though we don't actually see her. We have to imagine her at work, but she's completely engaged. So as far as the space is quite telling. And I suppose also writing this book during COVID, I kept thinking about, I've lived in New York. I'm a New Yorker by birth. And so I don't live there now, but I was quite sensitive to the way people often described, as we know, the constraints of COVID, and living with a partner, let's say during COVID, or any family member. And when you start seeing, and I was able, thanks to the NYU School of Social Work, because the Hopper's residence is owned by NYU now. So it's part of their complex. So you have to have permission to go in when it's possible to do so. In any event, they were kind enough to let me go see it, with the COVID protocols in place and all that. But it's small. It's a very small kitchenette between the 2 rooms. It's a north-facing studio, which he had as his bachelor digs. It has a bathroom down the hall. And until they were able, when over time, as artists, people, the building sort of emptied out, except for the Hoppers who lived there. Edward started living there in 1913. And then Joe, when they marry in 1924, she actually keeps her studio for a bit. And then when Arthur, their tabby cat, somehow wanders away on the streets of New York, she keeps it as a place to paint. But then that summer of 25, when the cat wanders away, and they're planning to leave for New Mexico as sort of I think that's, a chance to travel out west, see what that's about. But also maybe a type of honeymoon that the summer before, when they reached an ultimatum and an impasse. And she said, all right, I'll return to Gloucester on one condition: we marry today. And it was July 9th, and they married. And they then immediately left for Gloucester and spent their honeymoon, their real, the first honeymoon. But I think the second one was a traveling one. So at that point, she has no studio. And she really does not have a studio of her own again until Rockwell Kent's studio on that floor, former studio, becomes available. But it's unheated. And so it's extremely cold. She works in it. Usually she talks about how she's able to work in it until about the fall, after they come back, until it gets too cold. And she's able to get into it in the spring until they might leave. And eventually in 1930, they start going to Cape Cod. So they've made another summer plan. So she doesn't have a lot of time. And finally, in, around 1940, Edward Hopper agrees to buy heating oil to heat the studio for her. So after those years of struggling along, she finally has a place. And even on Cape Cod, I'm astounded that when they do, she inherits a small amount from her uncle unexpectedly, and they feel they're able to build a small cottage for themselves in South Truro, which they do. And he designs the cottage with a studio for him and not for her. So she often paints in the bedroom or outdoors or whenever he's not working in it, which turns out to be quite a lot, because he had some, whether it was low thyroid or just inertia of having painted all the subjects he wanted to paint already. He paints about 1 or 2 canvases a year at that point when they're living on Cape Cod. So it's not as prolific as he is when he's in his earlier years in Gloucester and New York.
I mean, there are similar stories. I mean, and you mentioned, like, even within this whole the whole Ashcan school of these painters marrying women who had studied painting in the same schools, and then their careers sort of subside. And I think back in art history, people like Berthe Morisot, or but there are other painters who had very strong women behind them. Like in an earlier episode, we profiled the life of Andrew Wyeth, and his wife Betsy is this strong person who was, just in every part pushing Wyeth as as a brand, forward. And I interviewed Bo Bartlett, who is a contemporary artist who Betsy had taken on as a project. She loved these projects. And I see a lot of the same spirit with Joe, that she's taking, she sees the promise in Hopper, and, it sees it as a project. If we can just put you in front of the right people, if we can, there's archiving that needs to be done. But I guess my question is, do we know either in her journals or his, how much she was invited into the process? Did she have a voice in critiquing his work in the studio?
So that's really interesting. So he writes so after this summer of 24, when they're back in Gloucester and he's coming back to New York, he's looking for representation at a New York gallery. And he initially goes to Crush Hour thinking that's where he'd want to be. And they turn him down, and he ends up with Frank Rain, who actually had a summer place in Gloucester. And it turns out that Frank Rain said, "Oh, just leave your watercolors. I'll take a look. And, I have to go out to lunch." But it turns out a woman sees one of them as he's sort of being persistent and spreading them out. And she notes that one of the houses looks just like one that her grandmother lived in. And so she wants to buy it. And with that, Frank Rain becomes Edward Hopper's dealer for life. So just like Joe in 1924, he's married. And now he has a dealer until really Frank Rain dies, and Peggy Rain becomes a very good friend. But he writes to the Frank from 1927. There's a letter when they're up in Portland painting the lighthouses at Port Elizabeth and Portland Head. And he writes saying, from, my biggest fan and best critic joins me in saying hello to you. So that's referring to Joe as the biggest fan of Edward Hopper and the best critic. So I think he knew that she had a great eye. And I think what often happens, and what I found in the narrative, is people tend to dismiss her, and it's quite extraordinary. And I did not include in the book some of the language that is used to really diminish her. She's described as the dumpy model in her 60s. She's actually always quite trim, but, she's not a 30-year-old young woman, which is how he over time imagines some of the models. She certainly performed all of the roles, whether it's of New York movie, of the usherette. They started in the right after Gloucester, but for Tables for Ladies, they start naming the characters in these scenarios. So they're clearly creating these compositions together. So she describes, as she begins keeping the record books in 1924 with their marriage, of his work and writing about and describing the work, she starts describing some of the roles of the different women. And some of them she doesn't approve of. She feels that one of them might be a tramp, but she's going to rise to the occasion and perform that role. So I think it's really interesting when you see her as the creative collaborator in the dramatical sense, because I think Edward Hopper, he may have been, we don't know, he might have been on the spectrum. He certainly was an introvert and contrarian. So it's hard to know whether he would have been able to have a model other than his wife, Jo. It's often seen in the other direction as she was overly controlling, but he might not have been able to become the creative, become as openly creative as he could with her being there. She talks about modeling for Girly Show, which I think is one of the most extraordinary works, where she's completely nude as a stripper of a contemporary burlesque, which says a lot about the roles. She was completely uninhibited. She was able to paint her self-portrait over 70 wearing, a pink bra that she says Edward gave her money for her birthday, and she went out and purchased. So I couldn't even think of another woman of her generation born in 1883 where I could even think of a self-portrait of a woman wearing lingerie like that. So right. She's clearly quite independent and able to, as you pointed out quite well, but she definitely saw something in him, as Betsy Wyeth did in Andrew, and also knew how to produce him, to help him see his way to the best Edward Hopper he could be. And I think for her, that's the creative act in this marriage and this partnership and this creative union, that she says, well, nobody who was in art school with him ever thought he was particularly extraordinary. They called him the John Singer Sargent, but they didn't see what I saw in him. And she does mention that, and I forgot to use that quote in the book, but I do think that's really important, that she had this eye for what he could be and gave him the confidence to get there.
There is a painting that you include in the book that is titled Obituary, and a painting of Joe's that is it's undated, so we don't know exactly when it was created. And it's rather conceptual in a way, and it's hard to tell whether it's reminiscent or full of regret. Can you describe that painting a little bit and maybe what you read into it?
at the Whitney. And when I started this project, and of course, again, it was COVID, it was one of the two of her works that was really available online that you could look at. And it is in oil, and I have seen it in the flesh. What was amazing to me is, so it's a painting of a vase of flowers. Many of them are dried seed pods that she was known to collect on Cape Cod. And we know that because when Brian O'Doherty, who was a good friend of the Hoppers and the spouse of Barbara Novak, one of the great Americanists, who was also my advisor at Columbia, he describes all these seed pods sitting all over their South Truro place. And so it's interesting because it's on a windowsill, but the windowsill is imaginary because beyond you can see both the house, a view of the Hopper house. So if it's on the windowsill looking out, sorry, I can't seem to find it right now. I'm just looking for it quickly. Here it is. So the Jenness house, one of the houses he painted a lot, the Jenness house, seems to be out below the window. So we think of, and the sea's in the distance. So we think we're on Cape Cod, and the house on the ridge just before the water looks very much like the Hopper house. So again, as you say, it's imagined if she's actually in the studio on the Cape. And then in the lower right corner, just beyond the sill, is the arch of Washington Square, which was visible from their fifth floor walk up at 3 Washington Square North, with buildings behind it. And there is this hand pulling the curtain back. And the only person, so we see this hand with the wedding band on the fourth finger, which is interesting because when Henry paints her as the art student, she, of course, is wearing a ring, but not on her marriage hand. And Arthur is peering around the curtain as well. So we see Arthur, but not Joe.
And Arthur being her cat, right?
Her tabby cat is peering, and he's got a blue collar on. So, is he the avatar? He was clearly beloved. And all we know really about Arthur is that she found him when she was really suffering from loneliness. She came back from a stint in France at the end of the war. She was there to rehabilitate veterans using art, and whether she was looking to spend more time with the French painters or perhaps even consider finding a spouse, she was older at that point, is unclear. But she came back, and all we know is she suffered from a broken heart of a man unnamed. Her mother died. Her brother was falling into alcoholism, and she was more or less destitute because she didn't have a job or an apartment. She'd given them up to be in Paris. So Arthur was her savior as a companion and maybe sort of a therapy cat, and kept her from becoming lonely. So, is it full of regret? I think she does talk about her paintings as the poor bastards. She knows that they're not getting the light of day they should, and she often hopes to engage those that come to the studio. And that's often, when you hear about her in the various articles in Time magazine, it's often taken up with this, oh, well, let's just try to get past the gatekeeper, Joe and Hopper, Joe Nivis and Hopper, and try to get to Edward. And they see her as this, controlling force. But I do think she felt that until very late in the game, when she has a show in Greenwich Village, and she's so excited to see her work, displayed in a gallery, and on its, highlighted in the local Villager paper. She just feels as though, she said, I feel as though my paintings finally had the day in the sun. And she does have this very prophetic statement, which is, for so many women artists, and this has been borne out, they have to really live out to become like, Carmen Herrera, almost 100 years old, before they can actually achieve a monographic show at a major museum. And, unfortunately, that just is the fact for women artists. So I did want to shed some light on the story that she's living, that she predicted was very much the course for many women artists still to this day, whether you're, regardless of your race. And it's obviously she was white, but, for many artists of color and women artists, this is even tougher.
At the end of the book, you kind of chronicle some opportunities that Hopper had to recognize his wife's contribution, but it seems like he chose not to. And I guess, 2 questions. One, why do you think he didn't take advantage of those opportunities to acknowledge her contribution? And is Two Comedians, his last painting, is that the closest we're going to get to that recognition?
I do think that is the recognition. And I think that comes at a time. First of all, he does help her with this this solo show she has in Greenwich Village. But, that's about 1958, and, he's going to die in 1967. So it's very late in the game. She's already, well into her 60s at that point, almost 70. I think my own guess was that, and it was a document that I found, in COVID, I was finding a lot of used books to be helpful because I couldn't get into libraries. And I found the catalog of the World's Fair of 1965, of the second, the World's Fair of New York, which was 64 and 65, where she appears selected by Brian O'Doherty, this curator, well known to the Hoppers, a good friend of theirs, as a lesser and unknown painter at the age of 82. And think about this. She's been painting her entire life. She's been showing her work professionally and being paid for her work from her earliest years of leaving the Normal College of New York City. And yet already still at 82, she's considered the lesser unknown. And it's just interesting that that's the year he takes up two comedians. And Edward Hopper does say on several occasions, if I could say it, because he was known to be very laconic and he had a slow manner of speaking. And I think Joe described it as, when you spoke with Edward Hopper and had a conversation, it was like throwing a stone down a well and you didn't know if it dropped and hit the bottom. But he does begin the two comedians at that point. And, they are dressed in the theatrical costumes he had painted himself early on after one of his early trips to Paris as the clown with the, Commedia dell'arte face. In this case, he's dressed as Pierrot. She could be Pierrette or possibly Columbine, but the point is they're part of this Commedia dell'arte. They're on this huge stage and they're taking this final bow. And he, the one figure is tall and lanky, the other a head shorter. So these profiles of Edward and Joe Hopper, and he gesturing to her and her gesturing back. I think that's as much as you're really going to get. He was very stinting even with his own male peers when it came to juries and to his teachers as well, even giving them credit. So I don't know if that's just a character trait that he didn't really love extending credit to others. But I do feel the two comedians, and with the inclusion of the foliage, this very horizontal architectural stage with the inlaid paneling, which again emphasizes the strength of it. She describes it in the record book as the prow of a ship. And she says, and what a dramatic ship. And then this green stage foliage that creeps in, I think that is very much her. And, she writes in the record book poignant in italics. And then later on, it's afterwards that she's having an interview and she states that she confirms that it's very much a personal statement. So I think that is as far as we're going to hear from Edward Hopper in the visual sense of his attributing her partnership in this way of the two comedians.
Well, the book is, I believe, is available now. I have a copy. And it is generously illustrated, and I really enjoyed spending time reading it. And the show is coming up in July at the Cape Ann Museum. And I mean, we have records of them spending time there in their day, correct?
We do. And we actually have one of the rare documents. We don't know that much about what they were actually doing. When I started out, I thought, I want to know where they're eating. I want to know where they're going. I mean, we did get a little bit of a gleaning here and there from the Gloucester Daily Times, which report on a lot of different activities happening in different parts, but they weren't really part of the arts organizations. They were there painting the sites they wanted to paint. But one document that does survive at the Cape Ann Museum is that she, Josephine Hopper, she signed it that way, signed the visitor's book when what is today the Cape Ann Museum was then the Cape Ann Historical and Literary Association, when it reopened its new, then renovated building on the same building where it is today in 1926, and they were staying nearby. So she clearly had the curiosity to go in and see the Cape Ann Museum and the present day. So that's even a more, I think, compelling reason to know that the very visitor book that she signed is right there, and it's going to be on view at the entrance to the museum. And you'll have a chance to walk the streets nearby the museum and see Our Lady of Good Voyage is still standing. the Anderson's house, the Abbott's house, the Prospect Street is just outside the museum. So we'll be doing a lot to help people find their way. And the museum already does do that, but we'll just augment that for these Hopper walking tours. And it'll be the Hoppers walking tours, because if you want to go see where the railroad yards, although they don't still exist, it's now the Shaw's Supermarket Plaza, but you can actually see the kinds of buildings that would have surrounded that area that are still there today. So I think it'll be exciting for people to walk in the footsteps of the Hoppers.
Well, Elliot, I really appreciate your willingness to sit down and have a conversation. Hopper's one of my favorite artists and favorite topics, and thank you for my newfound appreciation for Joe Nevison, and thanks for pulling back the curtain on this couple.
That's great. What a great analogy. And thank you, Craig. And I hope you're going to come up and please keep us posted when you come up to see the show. It opens July 22nd. And when we started this project, Oliver Barker, I said to him, well, how does July 22nd sound to you, 2023? And he said, why do you ask? I said, well, it's Hopper's birthday. So if we open there and we run through the long weekend in October, we hope to make the show accessible for school groups and those that are maybe traveling to New England during the long weekend in October. So we hope we capture the groups that like Gloucester in the summer, but also in the fall when it's quite attractive too.
Excellent. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.